How much time?
We're live. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Coming to you live. Has it been live? Wait, I forgot to say. Did I say we are live? We are live. Coming to you live. Has it been live? Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hey, it's hard to keep up with events.
Seriously.
There have been 3 significant Supreme Court decisions, all of which are helpful to Trump, but not as helpful as Trump has made out. Let's not forget, if not for the Supreme Court, it's highly unlikely that Trump would be president. That is, he still would have gone on trial, certainly for the January 6th case of trying to impede the peaceful transfer of power and overturn a free and fair election, and likely would have been convicted, and our politics would have been fundamentally different. Supreme Court also gave him broad immunity, essentially allowing him to follow up on what he said back in his first term. As president, I can do anything that I want. That's not literally true, but he is now broadly protected. And it was also the Supreme Court that tortured the disqualification clause of the 14th Amendment to make sure that Trump would not be bounced from any ballots in 2024.
But you said that this time around, they're not as pro-Trump as people think.
That's right. And
then why do we make our title, they sided with Trump?
Because they did side with Trump, but Trump, of course, overplays it.
Okay.
They are all wins for Trump.
Right.
But I think...
What are they? Tell the people what they are.
There are 3 of them.
Okay.
One that says, at least for now, they can use the Alien Enemies Act to deport individuals. 2, one that stayed the order requiring this legal immigrant who, according to an administrative error, was sent to this hellhole prison in El Salvador, one of the worst prisons maybe in the history of the world, or at least the modern history. We'll talk about that in a moment. They stayed the order that he had to be returned promptly. And thirdly, they stayed a lower court decision about the reinstatement of fired federal employees.
So the fired federal employees and the return of the Maryland man could still happen, but they've been delayed. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. It's not a final order, nor is the authorization of deportations under the Alien Enemies Act a final decision either.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
So that's one big reason why these aren't as big of victories as Trump and his allies have made it out. Imagine Trump exaggerating things.
Imagine that.
Yeah. So, this weekend, we're in we've had this disastrous market meltdown. We've had the free world in turmoil. We have 4 deceased American soldiers returned to the U.S. An incredibly difficult, poignant moment. And what does Trump do?
What happened to these soldiers? I don't know.
They died in Lithuania in some kind of accident. Yeah.
What was Trump doing?
What was Trump doing through all this?
Golfing.
Worse than that, bragging about his golfing.
Oh.
As if that was more important than what was going on for the troops that he's never honored, of course, called, troop suckers, called John McCain not a real hero because I don't like people who has been captured. And, what service has Trump done?
He owned the Miss America pageant. That's some service, right?
Yeah, and the Miss Teen, and apparently barged in on, partially dressed teenage girls, according to credible stories.
That was a joke. My point is that he hasn't done anything
in terms
of service
Mr. Bone
to the
Spars,
country.
I know. And the other thing about the ruling on the Alien Enemies Act that kind of got underplayed, but is important. I think it's a very dangerous decision if ultimately upheld. But they did indicate that they'd have to go through due process. They couldn't just summarily snatch people off the street and send them to the hellhole of the world in El Salvador.
That's a win? Isn't that supposed to be the baseline of American justice? It's like, yes, people deserve due process.
But they weren't giving them due process, were they?
No, but I mean,
so as I said, it's not as big a triumph for Trump because they haven't just ratified his sending. And by the way, have you seen these videos of these masked, unidentified people in unidentified vans grabbing women and men off the street?
Yeah, I told you earlier, you're a little late on this news.
I know,
it's like a week and a half old.
It's news that needs to be emphasized.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
Significance goes beyond one night. Have we ever seen anything like that before in U.S. history?
No.
Where do we see things like that?
1939 in Germany.
Exactly, or Italy, or, current China dictatorships. Only in horrible dictatorships have we seen anything like that.
I looked into the tough student who was grabbed off the street. All she did was write an op-ed in her student paper, essentially advocating for the lives of Palestinians. Nothing in it there was no mention of Hamas. There was no mention of destroying Israel, nothing to that nature.
And what did Trump say he was restoring from these woke people? Free speech.
He's the worst First Amendment president we've ever had. Come on.
It's not even close.
Not even close.
He only believes in free speech that agrees with him. Anything that doesn't agree with him is to be cracked down upon. Not only does he persecute people, as you say, for writing an op-ed that doesn't comport exactly with his policies, but he's dictated to the Smithsonian Institution, to other museums, to colleges and universities, that they don't have free speech.
To independent law firms.
Law firms.
There was a really good Daily episode either yesterday or the day before interviewing one of the people that quit from one of those really big law firms after they caved to Trump. It's a really good episode.
Yeah, so none of these folks, not the Smithsonian, not other museums, not colleges and universities, not law firms, have the right of free speech anymore. If your speech contradicts in any way either Trump's politics or his totally distorted, politically driven view of American history, your free speech is to be squelched, and all the powers that the president has, which is supposed to be used for the benefit of the American people and the good of the free world, is being directed against these institutions to make sure that they toe Trump's political line and Trump's distorted, self-serving view of history.
And also there's news today in correlation to him being an anti-First Amendment president. A judge, I think, ordered that he couldn't kick AP out of the White House press briefings. That's another thing he did. He tried to kick certain media that he didn't agree with out of the White House press briefings.
That's what they do in Russia and dictatorships. They do in his model country of Hungary. There's no free press, which, by the way, is also supposed to be constitutionally guaranteed by the First Amendment along with free speech, right?
The thing I don't get is people really eat this stuff up that Trump is really about Trump and Elon and all these guys are really about free speech when it's in plain daylight that they're not. I don't get why people fall for it so often.
Well, you got to understand where they get their information from.
Yeah, I guess so.
It's all inside the bubble. And anything that challenges the orthodoxy is not even considered, doesn't even penetrate. It's the deep state, it's the swamp, it's the lunatic lefties. We don't have to consider any alternative information. We can dismiss it out of hand.
Right. I know you wanted to comment on this Trump quote. Do you want to get to that now or later?
I want to get to it right away because it is so horrifying.
Here it is.
Horrifying to myself, and I think to you, Sam, as Jewish Americans who had family murdered in the Holocaust. Very common for Jewish Americans, right?
And just to give some context to this quote, Bibi Netanyahu was at the White House either yesterday, I can't remember, this week, and
I think it was today or yesterday.
It was yesterday, I think. And during their questioning, or when they fielded reporters' questioning, Trump started talking about how he was talking to the hostages who were being held by Hamas, and he added this to that response.
Right, gratuitously. And not only should Jewish Americans be offended to their core. Every American who believes in decency, in freedom, in humanity should be offended to the core by what Trump said here gratuitously. He wasn't even asked about it. He volunteered it. He was being asked about the hostages being held by Hamas. And what he said was absurd enough, Sam, right?
Right. He was talking about, did they like you? Did they wink at you? Did they give you an extra piece of bread? It's like, even if they did that, they're still hostages.
Yeah, this is like the old argument, oh, slavery wasn't so bad because they got fed and housed, you know. They were still slaves. They are still hostages. So, you know, his commentary was bad enough. But it gets much, much worse. What he adds unprompted.
Can you see that?
Yes. I'm going to read the whole thing. Did the Hamas show any signs of, like, help or liking you? We got a message here from your mom.
Just go. It's fine. Go. I got it.
Okay. Did the Hamas show any signs of, like, help or liking you? Did they wink? Did they give you a piece of bread extra? Did they give you a meal on the side? Crazy enough, but here it gets worse. After saying, did they do all these nice things for you? Like you know what happened in Germany. People would try and help people that were in unbelievable distress. Obviously, and you know, every independent observer, he has to be referring to Nazi Germany. That's when they had all of these prisoners and persons in concentration camps and death camps. And here he is implying that the Nazis treated the millions of people they put in concentrations and death camps really well. You know, they gave them an extra piece of bread. They winked at them. They gave them a meal on the side. They would help people. And here is the reality of what the Nazis were actually doing. Some of the worst human rights violations in history. Here's what a Nazi concentration camp or death camp really looked like. Does that look like they're treating them unbelievably well, Sam?
No.
Could not be more horrific. Starving them into skeletons, putting them in these little cages that even wouldn't be fit for an animal, much less human beings. And then, of course, in the death camps like Auschwitz, putting them into gas chambers and killing them by the millions. And you got to put this in context. This is not the first time that Trump has referred in a positive way to the Nazis. Credible, direct eyewitness sources have said that Trump said that he would like to have generals like Hitler's generals. What did Hitler's generals do? They not only, of course, defended the horrific Nazi regime, but they were directly responsible for murdering hundreds of thousands of Jews and other supposed enemies of the Third Reich as well. Yes, most Jews perished in the death camps, but hundreds of thousands were killed by the German generals who were running mobile killing units. That's right, killing units that were devoted simply to machine gunning down unarmed, innocent Jewish people. There is chilling testimony on this, Sam, from the famous Nuremberg trials of war criminals. And one of those who testified was one of the generals who commanded one of these mobile death squads. He was General Ohlendorf. And he was asked, why were you killing not just Jewish men, but Jewish women and Jewish children indiscriminately? He said, I did that because that was Hitler's order to all of us. Our job was to wipe the Jewish people off the face of the earth. And to do that, we had to kill everyone, particularly women and children, and not just men. Those are the German generals that Trump admires. And we see already he is purging the military of, career commanders without cause, simply because he doesn't believe, that they're simply going to bow down to his will. And let's not forget, Trump, put this in further context. He also borrowed Nazi rhetoric, applying it to migrants, saying they are poisoning the blood of the nation, just as Hitler said the Jews were poisoning the blood of Germany. So this is as horrific as this is. It's not isolated. It is part of a context, and that makes it even more chilling and more horrifying than it is on its face.
Yeah.
We've never seen, as Trump said, he always likes to say, this is something we've never seen before, right? Implying all the great stuff. Well, this is something we've never seen before.
Do you want to comment on what's happening with the markets? I mean, today they opened they were surging 800 points, an 800-point gain on the Dow.
It was 1,000 at one point.
Yeah, and then they sunk again, and now they're down 200
or
and
300. Yeah.
Monday they also spiked because of some false rumor that he was going to take back the tariffs. What's your reaction to all this stock market madness? I mean, we talked about the tariffs last week, but now we're seeing this.
And it's, yes, the rich are disproportionately represented in the stock market. That's true. But in today's America, tens of millions of people depend on the stock market for their retirement. And people are seeing their hard-earned retirement monies fading away. I think, I forget what the exact estimate is, that since he imposed these tariffs, something like $6 or $7 trillion in wealth has gone down the drain. Doesn't hurt, 100 million billionaires like Elon Musk, but it hurts average, ordinary Americans.
Well, it does hurt him because his stock is failing.
But who cares? So he's worth $300 billion instead of $400 billion. That's my point.
Right.
It doesn't directly hurt him. But people who are depending on their 401ks, for their retirement. And on top of that, they seem to be undermining Social Security. 70 million Americans get Social Security. Not all of them depend on it, because it's not income-based, but tens of millions of Americans also depend on their Social Security in their later years, and that is being threatened as well. Medicaid.
Yeah, I've heard the likes of Scott Besson going on TV saying this is only hurting the investor class. You're saying that's false.
Totally false. That may have been true at one time. It's not even remotely true today, because so many Americans have their retirement money in the market, or at least in part.
And I think the tariffs are going into effect tonight on the East Coast at midnight, if I'm not mistaken. Or
I think that's right. I'm not positive, but that sounds right to me.
And I saw on CNN before we went live that they're saying that when it goes live in China, it's going to be at 104%.
104%. And here's what's really going on. Why is Trump doing this? Violating, his most important campaign promise, which was supposedly to fix the disastrous Biden economy. Well, the Biden economy was not disastrous except for the disinformation put out by Musk and others. But B, instead of making the economy better, he's making it way worse, and he doesn't care. He's willing, he has no shame, doesn't care about anybody himself. He's doing this because he can bully people, because he can exercise power. But there's something else behind this. And, Trump has this crazy belief, that tariffs historically were great boons to the American economy, and lowering tariffs caused the Great Depression. Of course, we know just the opposite. Following the McKinley tariff of 1890, which Trump, talks about as a savior for the economy, we hit what, to that point in American history, was the worst depression. I talked about it last week, the depression of the 1890s, when in places like New York and Michigan, unemployment hit 35, 40% or more. People talked about soup kitchens as being Cleveland cafes, the president of the time. Then he said, Wilson reduced tariffs, and the result was the Great Depression. Complete misreading of history. Who took over the government? Which party in the 1920s?
I don't know.
The Republicans.
Oh.
They controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency throughout the 20s, right before the Great Depression. And what do you think they did with tariffs?
Whoop, 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 whoop.
Exactly. And then they made it much worse with the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930. So what he's really hoping for is to go back, people say he wants to go back to the 1980s or 1950s. He wants to go back to the 1880s or 1890s when, to a great extent, the U.S. drew its revenue from tariffs. And now he's hoping that you could get enough revenue from tariffs, even though ordinary Americans pay for it, so that he can have a huge personal income tax, primarily going to corporations and his rich friends.
Cuts.
Income tax cut, exactly. Yeah. Primarily going to corporations and his rich friends. So it's another complete distortion of history. What was the government doing in the 1880s and 1890s?
Not much.
Not much, mostly delivering the mail.
Yeah, and yesterday during his BB presser or whatever, he also went back to this false history lesson of the 1890s. He did it again. He did it in his tariff speech, and he did it again yesterday with BB.
Yeah. If you take your history from Donald Trump,
oh, God.
What do I have to tell you? You know what it is. My big bridge in my hometown.
If you take your history from Donald Trump,
yes.
You need God.
Yes, you do. I'd rather take my history from movies and cartoons.
Probably movies are probably a better place to
right, although I've always warned people, don't take your history from movies. But you're right.
Wait, you mean Iron Man isn't historically accurate?
Yeah, not exactly.
Oh, weird.
Movies aren't bad. Way better than Donald Trump. It's not even close. Any rate, the last thing I want to talk about before we get to questions and before we talk about my lectures, which we now have some big news about.
Big news.
Big news. I want to talk about the demonstrations. I think we have a picture here.
Oh, you sent me a picture?
I sent you a picture. You didn't put it up?
I didn't see a picture of demonstrations.
I sure sent it to you.
Pictures of... oh, yes, the anti-Trump... so... This?
Look at it.
Okay.
That's just one of, over 100 demonstrations all over the country. I think that's New York City. This was not, a few people showing up. Well, it's very difficult to estimate nationwide how many protesters there were. But there are those who claim it was in the millions.
You're really into these pictures today, huh?
A picture's worth 1,000 words.
This is the first time you've ever been like, oh, I want to send you a bunch of pictures.
I know.
Okay.
But, what's happening is so extraordinary. And I think it's important that our audience see it and not just hear it from this old professor.
This sign right here says Penguins United.
Do you know what that's referring to?
Yes, of course. The tariffs on the islands. Yeah.
Putting tariffs on an island with only penguins. Even worse, putting tariffs on Australia where we have a positive balance of trade.
Say it with me, Dad. Penguins United.
Penguins United. Penguins United. Very good.
Very good.
Yeah, so, he's lost the penguin vote.
Wow.
That's for sure. But the opposition is rising. We've never seen anything like this early on in a presidency, except maybe to extend Trump's first term.
I'm about to say,
Trump's first term.
But let me say something, because I was very actively involved in a lot of those early first term protests. Yeah. And I have to say, I felt pretty... I left feeling pretty hopeless. It kind of just felt like I had spent so much time and energy. I was living in Boston at the time, and there was these massive protests in Boston, and nothing changed.
Yeah. I think, you make a good point. But I think in this context, these demonstrations are important in one regard. Remember my one-sentence description of American politics?
Republicans have no principles. Democrats have no spine.
Right. Obviously, this is not going to change the Republicans, but it might help stiffen the Democrats' spine if they understand that there is a mass movement behind them.
There was a mass movement behind them the first term, too.
But I think this is different. As bad as the first term was, by orders of magnitude, the first 2 months of this term are vastly worse than the first 2 months of the first term.
Yeah.
Not close.
I'm not as optimistic as you. Again, I felt, I was, in my 20s, I was young, I hit the streets. Everybody says, hit the streets, that's how you make a change. And I hit the streets, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and nothing changed.
Except Trump lost.
Yeah, but then he won again.
Right, but, by that time, the demonstrations were 7 years old.
And if you look at the keys, he didn't lose because of demonstrations.
No, I understand that.
Although he did lose the social unrest.
Lost the social unrest?
But he mostly lost because of his handling of COVID, for the most part. He lost the most keys
this
because
is true.
of that.
But, again, if there is a silver lining here, it is stiffening the spine of Democrats. And we're beginning to see that, even in the usually, cowardly Democratic Congress. We're beginning to see Democrats and independents taking on Trump in a way we haven't seen before. It's early. This may all fizzle out, but I'd rather see this than not. Let's put it that way.
I remember there was that big women's march in early.
Yes.
I mean, that was millions of people too.
Yes, I understand that.
Okay.
But it's a different context, is what I'm saying. Okay. And the Democrats particularly need some stiffening of the spine.
Gotcha. I don't disagree with that, for sure.
Yeah, we'll see. Any rate, let's talk about my lectures, my course.
Get in here, Dad.
It's 4 lectures for the renowned 92 Street Y in New York.
92nd Street.
92nd Street on the 4 pivotal elections in American history. It's an historical. A lot of our fans have saying they want to hear more history. It's difficult in the context of the show, but these lectures are designed to talk about history. I'm going to share with you my views and take your questions on the elections of 1800, 1860, 1932, and 2024.
Nice. Philip H. just gifted 5 memberships. Thank you, Philip. Do you want to tell people what the code is for 50% off?
Yes. I mean, I can't tell them, but can we get it up there?
Savannah, if you could put the link to the course and the code and then pin it to the chat, that'd be great. Because
we love our audience so much, we are offering to our audience a unique 50% off, which makes it almost free. It's really going to reduce the price to a very low level for, these 4 expert talks. Believe me, when I usually give a talk, I charge a lot. So, this is a bargain and your chance to talk with me, not so much about contemporary politics, but about our incredible history.
Krasimir Boyanov also just gifted 5 memberships. Thank you so much.
Beautiful.
While we're at it, why don't we get into our housekeeping? So,
yes.
Why are memberships important on this channel? Because we glean a lot of our questions from our members. Members and donations get priority on questions. If you're a member, if you're a new member, I know a lot of people have been very generous recently about gifting memberships. If you're new and you don't know how this works, we put in our community tab or the post tab, we make a post every day before the show starts saying, hey members, leave your questions here. We use that to glean, and then they're put on a Google Doc, which I use to present this man with questions. If you haven't liked the stream already, please like the stream, because we got 1,300, almost 1,400 people watching, but only 400 likes. That's not good. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe and click that notification bell so you know when we go live.
And do we post the discount, how they can get it?
Savannah has posted the discount.
Yep,
the code
Savannah's awesome.
Allan RT50 for 50% off. and the link is in the pinned chat as well. All right, are you ready to get to some preguntas, Dad? You know what preguntas means?
In Espanol, yes, I do.
Nice.
I know a little bit of Espanol, but don't test me.
I'm not going to. Our first question is from one of our members, Bonnie Miller. They say, Allan, what are we to think of SCOTUS and their refusal to follow the Constitution and the rule of law? Just your thoughts. I know you're not a lawyer, but you know a lot about so much.
Yeah, Richard Nixon. A lot goes back to Nixon, 1968.
Yes.
Really introduced in a major way in our politics the idea of strict construction of the law and the Constitution. At the time, conservatives were railing against the liberal decisions of the Supreme Court headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren. By the way, what party was Earl Warren, do you know?
Republican.
Republican. He ran for vice president, was governor of California on the Republican ticket, was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower. And the claim was that the Warren court was reading their values into the Constitution rather than adhering to the strict construction of the Constitution. To whatever extent there was any merit, and I don't think there was much to that claim, it's completely turned around. Now what we've seen with the Supreme Court in their decisions on the Second Amendment, on abortion rights, on the disqualification clause of the 14th Amendment, on presidential immunity, on the Alien Enemies Act, is they are, in effect, reading present-day values into their interpretation of the Constitution. And given that you have six conservatives, a six-conservative majority, it's not surprising that the decisions come down in favor of conservative and Republican politics. I'm not saying they're strictly political, but certainly if you analyze what the court has been doing over the last decade or so, clearly political views and political interests are coming into play. Even conservative scholars have criticized Supreme Court decisions, saying this conservative court has abandoned the supposed conservative commitment to strict construction and not interpretation, but simply reading the plain meaning of the Constitution as it was understood at the time. And certainly the Alien Enemies Act, as it was understood at the time, was understood to deal with warfare, and has only been used, you know how many times it's been used?
Once?
3. All declared wars. 1812, World War I. The last time was way back during World War II. It also talks about an invasion or an incursion, but clearly they were talking about incursions or invasions by foreign powers, not migrants seeking residence or asylum in the U.S.
Professor, this Trump Supreme Court seems eager to reward his wishes. Do you share my fear that he may use them to twist the 22nd Amendment, which is the term limit amendment, in his favor?
You know, the hallmark of a dictator is that they have no respect for democratic values or institutions. They believe they have a right to rule and should be ruling for life, regardless of what the ruling documents of their nation, like the Constitution, might have to say. And Trump certainly has talked about wanting to emulate Vladimir Putin, become president for life. I'm not sure, at his age that's possible, but leave that aside. And he has talked about various mechanisms for doing that, one of which is to run as vice president and then have the president resign and have him become president. Another would be to become Speaker of the House. You don't have to be a member of the House. And then have the president and the vice president resign, and the Speaker would be next in line. And there are other musings that I had, all of which would come, obviously, to the Supreme Court. And obviously, as in other cases, Trump would be counting on the Supreme Court bailing him out. I don't think it's going to happen, but, I think that's in the mind of Trump.
Green Entertainment with a $5 donation. They say, first part of their question is, have you ever heard of Jordan Cash?
Jordan, I hate those questions. You're trying to catch me on something. I'm not going to answer any questions like that.
Okay. Damn.
If you want to ask me about Jordan Cash, do so, but don't.
Well, they do. They say.
All right, then let's go ahead.
Well, they say. Okay, I'm just going to read the whole question.
No, you don't. All right, go ahead. Read the whole question.
Have you heard of Jordan Cash? If so, what are your thoughts? Do you believe his content is accurate information on what's happening in NYC?
You see, the way that question should have been asked.
Okay.
Jordan Cash says, this is what's going on in New York City. Do you agree? Rather than saying, have you heard of him? Do you know what he said? I haven't heard of everyone. I've heard of a lot of people.
Right.
I know what a lot of people say.
Right.
I don't know what everyone says. So if you want to ask me a question about what someone says, tell me what they say.
Fair point. Remember, Ben England says, what is the history of the veto power? Sounds like Trump may veto any legislation that attempts to limit his tariffs.
Well, the veto power is one of the enumerated powers in the Constitution. That is, it is spelled out in black and white in the Constitution, unlike things like executive privilege or executive orders, which are so-called implied powers. That is, they're not spelled out in the Constitution, but they are implied in the power of the presidency. The veto is one of the mechanisms for checks and balances within the Constitution. That is, the president has a right to veto congressional legislation. But if the president vetoes congressional legislation, what can Congress do, Sam?
I don't know.
Override the veto. The veto is not absolute, but it takes a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress to override a veto, something that cannot happen in the current Congress. You can't get 2/3 of the Congress to agree on how to spell their name, much less to override a veto. So yes, Trump can veto any legislation that comes out of Congress, and except in a very extreme case, it's incredibly unlikely that his veto would be overturned.
Right. I also noticed that Bilal, I forgot, Nadeem, I think is their name. They also gifted a membership, so thank you.
Thank you.
This is one of our Discord questions. If you want to be a member of our Discord, the link to that is in our link tree in the description of this video. This is from Colored Duck. They say, does Trump not having a normal perspective of money/cost affect his views on how bad tariffs are? We've talked about that. He's doing this from his perspective, which is a rich man.
A rich man's perspective, and a delusional, as always, an inaccurate, self-serving, delusional view of history. Not just, a minor matter of interpretation, but fundamental misreadings of history. And by the way, he wants to impose his misreadings of history on the rest of us. He wants the Smithsonian Institution, the keeper of our heritage, to reflect his distorted views of history. He wants us in colleges and universities to teach his distorted, self-serving view of history. If you don't believe me, take a look at the 1776 report. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
This is a report that Trump issued towards the tail end of his first term. And it was supposed to be a guide to the teaching of history for every history teacher in America. And it could not have been a more politically driven, distorted view of history. 47, and maybe more, but 47 when I saw it, of the nation's leading scholarly and academic organizations signed on to a letter by the American Historical Association condemning the 1776 report for totally distorting and misrepresenting our history and having a politically driven rather than an accurate history.
Can tariffs be useful to protect industries, for example, steel and manufacturing, as many in the labor unions and some Democrats like Chris D'Aluzzo are saying?
Historically, tariffs have been used to protect certain industries. The problem is Trump has not designed his tariffs in a surgical manner, has he, Sam?
No.
He's just blunderbussed them across the world in response to a totally bogus measure. You know, those so-called foreign tariffs that he claims, you know, he wants to match 50% are not tariffs at all. They're something made up. They're the total trade and the trade deficit. So you take the trade deficit, you divide it by the total trade. And even beyond that, I don't know what he does with countries like Australia, where we have a positive balance of trade. And we should be we should have no tariffs on them at all. But yes, there is some value if very carefully designed tariffs. But the problem is, even when you try to protect certain industries, what do other governments do when you put tariffs on things they're sending here?
I don't know.
They retaliate.
Right.
That's how you get a trade war.
And I said this last week, but the UAW president said very specifically that while he did support the tariffs, he thought that they were only one step in the right direction, that other things need to be done to protect auto workers. So, and he also said that it's a tool that needs to be used wisely, which Trump obviously is not doing.
Unions have traditionally been somewhat protectionist because they're afraid that if you have a free trade economy, it's going to bring their wages down because they have to compete, you know, with foreign workers getting $5 an hour, not $30 an hour.
Right, and that's a massive issue I think we're going to face now is how is the labor market going to look? Are they going to try to match they can't match Vietnam's labor market. I mean, it's not even possible, but... Yeah,
why would industries move from Vietnam? Forget tariffs. If there were no tariffs at all, where they pay I'm not sure what they pay, but I'm just hypothetically saying $5 an hour, maybe lower, maybe a little higher, to move to the U.S. to pay $30 an hour.
Corporations have one goal, and that's making money.
Yeah. And, you know, Trump said, you don't have to worry about Musk. He's got so much money, he doesn't care. Well, the more money you have, the more money you want.
And he wants his corporations to grow and become richer and more powerful. I mean, that's all bullshit. Wow, Bonnie Miller just sent a $100 donation. They said, "Thank you for responding to my question. You helped me understand."
Which question was that? Do you remember?
That was the first question of the night about SCOTUS.
Oh, I did respond at length to that. Thank you, Bonnie.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. You're the best.
Yeah. And I do try when I can to give as much depth and detail that you're not going to get anywhere else. No one else would have talked about strict construction in the Warren Court and Nixon and right. You wouldn't have gotten that on CNN or Fox or MS.
I've been going live during the day, and sometimes I put on CNN videos to react to or MSNBC. They're so boring. They're just like these talking heads who just drone on forever about nothing. And
they're predictable. You know what the Democratic talking heads are going to say. You know what the Republican talking heads are going to say.
Yeah.
You know, it's all, you know, their talking points, and we know what they are. I've stopped listening to panels, and I won't go on panels.
Yeah.
Last time I went on a panel, I got personally attacked, viciously, gratuitously. I'm just not going to do it.
That was the infamous Piers Morgan.
Oh, that was just horrible.
That was funny.
Totally ambushed.
And you blame me for that.
I know. But I did blame you for that. I still blame you for that.
I told you to go on Piers Morgan when he first came onto YouTube with as a storm. He was getting millions of views, a lot of clicks, a lot of engagement, and then he very quickly turned into the Jerry Springer of politics. If you had asked me when you did it, if you should do it, I probably would have said no.
Yeah.
Especially if I knew Cenk was going to be on the panel with you.
Yeah.
Anyways,
it's long gone and forgotten.
I don't know if it's forgotten.
Oh, you think people remember that? Come on.
They probably don't think about it on a day-to-day basis, but our next question is from member James LaGruta. They say, do you think Trump will continue to impose more tariffs or eventually back off or both, or what do you think?
I'm not sure he can impose more tariffs.
He imposed more on China already.
I know. I'm about to say he's kind of peaked out certainly in China and 104%. You know, who knows? Here's the thing. If someone is doing something rationally and logically and based on history, you can figure out what they're doing, right, Sam?
Right, you can predict it.
But how can you figure out what Trump might do?
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, all of those possibilities are in play. He could increase tariffs. He could leave them where they are. He could back off. I think maybe he's trying to get other nations to bully them into reducing their tariffs, and then he'll reduce his.
But didn't Vietnam already come and say that they were willing to reduce their tariffs, and they said no?
Yeah, and that was tricky, too. Again, I'm not an expert on this. I'm not an economist, certainly not an international economist. But apparently the trade barriers of Vietnam are not tariffs. They're non-tariff trade barriers of various kinds.
Okay, that just makes it even more confusing.
It gets very... Look, there's one thing, throughout my career, I've said, it's really impossible to understand unless you are immersed in it as your life's work is international trade issues.
Seriously, yeah. That stuff is mad confusing. Our next question is from Casper, Chicago. They say, Dr. Lichtman, do you see big business rebelling against the Republicans because of these tariffs?
I have a great friend by the name of Mike Casper in Chicago. I wonder if that's Mike. Or
hey, Mike. Hey, Mike.
If it is, I love you, Mike, and I'll be talking to you soon. Let me go back to the question there. I got a little distracted.
It is, do you see big business rebelling against the Republicans because of these tariffs?
I don't. They'll make noise. They'll complain. They'll bellyache. But I don't think in the end his allies in business are going to desert him because they're getting huge other benefits from Trump. Remember, underlying these tariffs is this huge tax cut that is going to benefit his business and corporate allies. And then on top of that, they're getting all this deregulation. Pretty much they're going to be able to do what they want, without the Consumer Financial Protection Board, without the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, without the Environmental Protection Agency, without the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, any of these regulatory agencies supervising what they're doing. They want to go back literally to the 1920s, or maybe, as we said, to the 1880s and 1890s, when business was relatively uncontrolled, when a few mega-rich people like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers controlled what, by today's dollars, is many hundreds of billions, and the vast majority of Americans were struggling.
A $5 donation from Jay Nicole. They say, do you think other countries, particularly our allies, are going to try to appease Trump as they seem to be giving in to demands to avoid conflict?
I think that's a real possibility. Trump is by far, the most powerful leader in the world, and he's a bully. And this is what he's done all his life, is bullying people to bend to his will. And that works. Bullying works. It takes a lot to stand up to a bully. We've seen some of our allies showing a backbone, but again, it's an open question how much of a backbone they will show over the longer run.
Peggy Cox says, if Trump does veto a bipartisan bill to stop his tariffs, what other options does Congress have and the American people to stop these tariffs? Is impeachment a possibility if enough Republicans join the Dems?
They really don't have much in the way of instrumentalities to stop Trump from doing what he wants with tariffs. Impeachment is not a possibility, or even if Trump was impeached. He's been impeached twice. And what's happened both times when it got to the Senate, Sam?
He was not removed.
Yeah. The chances of, what are the chances of getting 67 senators to remove him?
Very small.
Slim and none.
At this point, I don't feel like...
The Republicans have a 53 majority, so 20 Republicans would have to join with 47 Democrats.
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. So, no, there's really no threat that can be leveled against Trump, particularly for someone who believes he's above the law. And this is not me. He said it explicitly. Way back in his first term, he said, I can do anything I want as president. He called himself a king recently. He said, because I'm saving the country, I am not bound by the laws.
George just donated 5 memberships. Thank you, George. We appreciate that.
This is really helpful.
Yeah. Another Discord question from Senator Blutarski.
Senator, thank you.
Who's Senator Blutarski?
Yes.
Do you know who is that? You don't know. Oh, you don't like
no
those
senator
questions.
I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Please don't ask me those questions.
Okay.
I thought I went through a whole diatribe.
You did. I think it's a joke. That was,
I know.
Okay. Difference between a tariff and a value-added tax, VAT. My sister, who has a finance degree and is a Trump supporter, claims that when she bought a Japanese automobile a few years ago, she asked the dealerships about an itemization, VAT, value-added tax. The dealership explained that it is a charge by the Japanese government. She supports Trump and believes his tariffs will somehow eventually reduce this fee that American consumers pay for Japanese automobiles. Sounds like a tariff to me. I think this may be misinformation, probably spread on Fox News to obfuscate the real issues with tariffs.
Yeah, it's a great question. Very smart question. Again, I'm not an economist and certainly not an international economist. But my understanding is a value-added tax is fundamentally different than a tariff. A value-added tax, as I understand it, is kind of like a sales tax. That is, it's a tax added on to a purchase. And I could be wrong, but I do not believe that foreign governments can impose value-added taxes in the U.S. It may be they hike the prices because of value-added taxes on products that they have to deal with at home, but they don't, as I understand it, put a value-added tax on in the U.S. Moreover, tariffs will not abrogate the value-added tax. That is how, at least in part, foreign nations finance their government, and they're not about to abolish it because of tariffs.
Right.
It's something separate and apart.
Separate and apart. Member Krasimir Boyanov, who I believe donated memberships today. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Do you think we should go to the streets and protest every month like we did last weekend?
Absolutely. If you can get the crowds. The danger of too many protests is, as Sam said, people lose energy and enthusiasm.
Yeah.
So I'm a little skeptical about protests every month, but so long as you can maintain the enthusiasm in the crowds, you shouldn't stop at this one day of protests.
Member Callie7912 says, why is the legacy media vastly underreporting the amount of people who attended the hands-off protest? They claim it was tens of thousands when it clearly was millions of people. What's their motivation? Money, capitulation to Trump, trying to lure MAGA viewers. How can we, the people, urge the media to be honest in their reporting? Are they saying that? I don't know.
It's mixed. Again, I haven't reviewed every commentary, but I did see some of the media. I get Google News and AP News and some other news feeds. Some of the media did accurately report that it was in the millions. But the bigger issue is the very smart viewer is correct. A lot of the mainstream media is kowtowing to Trump. We've seen that in 2 of the most important flagship newspapers in America. You know what those 2 papers are?
Washington Post and New York Times.
Los Angeles Times.
Oh.
Close.
Which one? So it's New York. What? Which one?
Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, both owned by billionaires kowtowing to Trump, especially the Washington Post. It's really turned into certainly in terms of its editorial policy, a pro-Trump outlet. The other thing is, who owns now the mainstream media, Sam?
Billionaires.
Yeah, the big corporations.
Oh, and big corporations,
yeah.
Right. But a lot of these big papers are now owned by, like, Washington Post is Jeff Bezos. LA Times is also owned by some big billionaire.
Big billionaire. Disney owns, what is it, ABC, I think. Big companies own the mainstream, or billionaires own the mainstream media. And it is in their interest, number one, to avoid retaliation by Trump, and number two, to curry favor to get benefits from Trump. So there was a lot of bias. I'm not saying the bias totally taints the mainstream media. I still think there's a lot of good things coming out of the mainstream media. Certainly the New York Times has really maintained its integrity. Another outlet that I am very, very high on is The Guardian, which is not dependent on a billionaire or a corporation, but is funded by a long-standing Scottish trust, so it can be totally independent.
Can I hear your best Scottish accent?
No, you cannot.
Damn it. All right.
Every time you have me sing or give an accent, you say how terrible it is.
But the people want it. The people like it. Yeah, I mean, I generally believe that most mainstream media outlets are full of really good journalists. And I'm not
Absolutely.
I'm not talking about the talking heads on cable news.
No.
But I'm talking about, people who fact check stories and get their sources and double check their there are really, really good journalists still out there.
But unfortunately, they don't control the outlets. That's the big problem.
We have almost 1,500 people watching, but only 700 likes. I want to see that those likes up to 1,000. What do you think, Dad?
I think that's a reasonable goal.
Yeah.
And it really helps us.
Yeah.
If you want all this in-depth commentary, support us. It's not easy, to put this on.
It's not easy being greasy. Am I right?
You are right.
What is that? I went for a high five. Yes. Okay.
That's my bad shoulder.
Oh, sorry.
You know what I did today, Sam?
Yes.
I ran 6 miles.
Yeah.
And did a killer 1-hour gym workout.
Nice.
Yeah. That's why my shoulder's hurting a little.
This is from Nan B. They say, 1, will the United States be kicked out of the WTO? 2.
Let's stop with that.
Okay.
50-50.
What's the WTO?
World Trade Organization.
Okay. 50-50. 2, medication is protected from tariffs, but could China and India slap tariffs on medication to retaliate against the United States?
Again, keep in mind, I'm not an economist and certainly not an international trade economist. But as far as I understand it, they can do whatever they want. How do we stop them?
Yikes.
We can go to the WTA, but we're out of it. WTO.
What's the WTA? The
World Trade Organization.
No, you said the WTA. That's the World Tennis Association, I think.
Probably the tennis players won't help them, but who knows?
Can I see your best serve?
A sore shoulder.
Sore shoulder. Oh, yeah.
Can't play tennis anymore.
$5 donation from Tony DeMasi. They say, how do you assess the long-term impact of the tariffs on global trade, particularly in terms of shifting alliances? People want you to be an international trade expert.
I know, and I'm doing my best.
Yeah.
I'm really doing my best to try to answer these questions very specifically. And I do know the history. The long-term impact of tariffs is trade war. Gums up international trade. And that's far more important today than it was when the McKinley tariff that Trump loves so much was passed. When the McKinley tariff was passed, we were not a global economy. Only 4.5% of the American economy was dependent on international trade. Today, it's more than triple that, close to 15%. And the last thing we need is a global trade war. And my understanding is when you have a trade war, when you have all these barriers, it also increases inflation because it clogs up the supply chain. And that's extremely important when it comes to price of goods. And yes, this is already undermining our allies. It's not like we're targeting only China, North Korea, and Russia. In fact, as I understand it, we haven't imposed any tariffs on Russia or North Korea, have we? I don't think so.
North Korea, that'd be a little ridiculous.
Yeah,
right?
but if we impose them on penguins, we can impose them on North Korea, right?
That's fair.
So I do think, along with lots of other things that Trump is doing and saying, the collective security, the global alliance like NATO, that has kept Western democracies safe since the end of World War II is in jeopardy. It's become much more shaky.
Speaking of World War II, member Walter Dominics asks, without war, would Germany ever have been able to get rid of the Nazis and Hitler?
Again, it's a hypothetical, right? That's impossible to answer. But I can say it would have been very, very difficult because of the total control that Hitler and the Nazis had on Germany. And I hate to say this, but they also had the support of ordinary Germans. There's a number of books about that, pointing out it wasn't just the repression. It was also the control. I talked about this a lot on this show. The control of education, the control of information, the control of people's ideas and loyalties that cemented most of the German people to the regime. It wasn't like there was this enormous groundswell of opposition. There's a wonderful old movie called 1, 2, 3 about the Berlin building of the Berlin Wall, and one of the characters is a German who had been involved in World War II, and they kept asking him, what do you know about, the horrors of the Nazis? And he would say, I know nothing. I was in the subway the whole time.
That's funny. All right, we've hit an hour. We've hit 10 p.m. Eastern.
Is it 10 p.m. already?
Wow.
When you're having fun, time flies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
3 more questions.
Whoa!
I'm feeling good, even though my shoulder's hurting.
Why don't you put your bad shoulder, which bad, what is it? Which
the right shoulder.
So just hold it with your left arm.
Oh, you're like a doctor.
And relax your right arm. Is that okay?
Yeah, I guess.
Okay.
Doesn't seem to make much difference.
How dangerous is it that Elon Musk is influencing now UK politics and helping people like Nigel Farage to win elections?
It's unbelievably dangerous. That it's not just UK politics, he's also influencing German politics. We were talking about Trump invoking, in a positive way, Nazi Germany. Well, do you remember what Elon Musk said to the German people when he promoted a far-right, fascist, sympathetic party in Germany? He said, let's put all of this past behind us. Let's not dwell on it as if the Holocaust was some minor blip in German history that we really don't need to pay attention to anymore or draw lessons from anymore. Yes, when you've got all that money and you're supporting these dangerous, far-right extremist parties and politicians, it's incredibly dangerous.
Member the HuffPuff 10 says, well, how difficult is it going to be to find employment/live given the implosion of the world's economy? Is this looking like a Great Depression version 2? Really wish I was not graduating into this.
Well, I hope your outlook after your graduation can improve and look up, and I wish you all the best. Can you keep that question up? At this point, it doesn't look like another Great Depression. We had talked about this before. So much of what has helped ordinary people was adopted by Democratic presidents and Democratic Congresses. Things like Social Security, the insurance of bank deposits, mortgage loans for people to buy homes, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, the Affordable Care Act. All of these things, none of these things were in place in 1929 when the Great Depression hit. And we haven't had a depression since 1929 to 1933. Haven't had another one, in large part because of all of these cushions that are in place that keeps us from falling into anything like the Great Depression, plus all the regulations. Trump wants to abolish all the regulations. Well, as we know, depressions, recessions are often the result of illicit or outright illegal activities by corporations, like phoning up their stocks, or, as we saw in the Great Recession of 2008, I thought the movie The Big Short gave a pretty good insight into the shenanigans that were going on. So there are all these things in place, but if Trump weakens all of them, then, all bets are off.
Oh, you're a movie maven tonight. You're just giving all these movie recommendations.
Not bad, huh?
Not bad. Our final question of the night. People might be sad this is the final question, but what's the good news, Dad?
The good news is Sammy Licht will be on in his after show.
The Lichtman Live after show is coming on right after on my channel at Sam Lichtman. Well, Savannah, can you put the link to that in the chat and pin it? That would be great.
Before we get to the last question, let me remind you to sign up for my lectures. They're on, they're on discount just for you.
Right. The code is Allan RT50. And we're at 907 likes. I said I wanted 1,000.
Well, we're getting there.
Come on, people.
We got, what, 2 more minutes to
get 100.
Get 100.
Likes.
We can do it. I have faith in our brilliant audience.
This is from member Hillary Hacks. They say, were we always two parties? When did the parties break apart? Were there hostile takeovers of parties, or did the parties split into multiple parties?
Oh, they want a whole history in the last minute.
Yes.
Well, in the early republic, there really weren't parties in the modern sense, at least at the very beginning. And for the most part, we have been two-party. There was a period after the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800 through the election of 1824, when it began to fall apart, when we were really only one party. The old Federalist Party of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton was fading away, and what was called then the Democratic Republican Party of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson really controlled everything, and that began to break apart in the election of 1824, and then we kind of entered a period of chaos until the formation of the Whig Party in the 1830s as an alternative to the old Jefferson Party, which was now known as the Democrats. So we had the Democrats versus the Whigs. Then the Whigs fell apart in the early 1850s, leading to the modern two-party system of Republicans and Democrats. What we've never had is a multi-party system. We've had periods of one-party domination, periods of two-party domination, with third parties having a role, but not really able to elect presidents or members of Congress. But so we pretty much have either been a chaotic system briefly, or really, certainly since the election of 1860, a solid two-party system.
Why do we need parties at all?
We don't. George Washington was totally against parties.
Yeah.
He said they're divisive, they create factions and hostilities, they make it more difficult to hold the nation together, but they also organize. They're a way of organizing preferences, of sponsoring candidates, of creating majorities for legislation.
Okay, I'm with George on this one.
Maybe we could call you George Washington II.
We are 16 likes away from hitting 1,000. 16 likes away, people, from hitting 1,000. We hit 86 in that last minute.
Tell you what, if we get the 16 likes, let me take one more question just so we can get those extra likes.
One more question.
I'm extending myself.
We're extending ourselves here.
And I gave a pretty long answer.
And you gave a pretty long answer.
Question.
This one looks like a long.
And if you want a better answer to that, sign up for my lectures. I'll be talking about that a lot.
This one seems like a long, complicated question.
That's too long for the last question.
All right.
Save it. I'd love to answer that question, but not in the last minute.
Here's an easy one. Can you share whether you were involved with turbulent student movements of the 60s, and could the protests against Trump escalate to that level?
I entered college in 1963.
What?
Believe it or not.
What?
Class of 67.
What are you, 200 years old?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And when I entered college, it was the old system. No one was doing drugs. No one was protesting. We had rules of 3 feet on the floor if a woman would enter your dorm room. And of course, we had women's dorms and men's dorms. When I graduated, it was the new world of the 1960s. Drugs, sex, rock and roll, protests. So I kind of straddled 2 eras. Yes, I was involved in some of the protests, particularly more in the 70s, but I was not in the forefront of them.
Nice. That's a good final question.
It's an excellent final
and
question.
We've crossed 1,000 likes. We got 1,056 likes, Dad. Heck
all right.
Yeah. High five.
High
all
five.
We are going to let this man go rest. The Lichtman Live post show is coming up right after this, so stay tuned. What are your final words to the people, Dad?
I understand, Sam's experience with protests, how they can be disillusioned. Don't be disillusioned. I welcome and applaud people voting with their feet and protesting. And it does seem to be giving the Democrats, for the first time that I can remember, and I have a long memory, a real spine.
All right, with that, we will wrap up Lichtman Live for the night. Thank you all for helping us reach that 1,000 like threshold. That's it for Lichtman Live. See you all on Lichtman Live post show.
I recommend the post show. Someone young and sharp.